This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Reading these two papers in conjunction with each other, what came across most powerfully for me was the ways in which motherhood itself is mediated not only through religious cultures and expectations, but also through secular-based contexts as well. More generally, there's a responsibility on mothers to be self-sacrificing and to centre their whole lives around their children. It's no coincidence that popular and academic tomes on motherhood, which tend to focus very little on religion incidentally, chart the overwhelming evidence regarding the demands of motherhood. And one of the ones that I most recently picked up, it's been out a while, from 2011, was Rebecca Asher's Shattered, Modern Motherhood and the Illusion of Equality. So that's to a populist market. But the themes here have been captured in many other works. Now, Sharon Hayes, in the book The Cultural Contradictions of Motherhood, coins a term which has resonated much with me, and that's the term of intensive motherhood. And this captures the way in which motherhood has changed dramatically over the last 30 years, so it really situates itself in that sort of post-68 climate. And as it's sort of this contradiction that emerges, that, you know, with the added responsibilities of engaging with paid work, one would think that responsibilities on mothers would diminish. But what Hayes maps is actually the opposite has occurred, and new expectations have arisen, so the expectations themselves have intensified. Middle-class motherhood is now defined through a vast array of expectations, often referenced in a tongue-in-cheek way in the broadsheet Sunday supplements. So, you know, this garnering of cultural capital, which seems to be a particular focus, whether that be through the ballet lessons or the piano lessons or horse riding or whatever. And as a child-focused parenting encounter, what Hayes is mapping here is the intensive amounts of time, money and energy that's required in order to give one's offspring the idealised childhood that is sold to us in contemporary life. And that, the point that she's making is that that responsibility tends to fall on mothers, not fathers. Something akin to children's spiritual life is often not referenced in these accounts, but what these two papers that we've heard this afternoon powerfully demonstrate is what happens when we throw religion into the mix. We see expressions of intensive motherhood in both of these papers. For Dawn's sample, there is a need for mothers to display that they are able to competently raise their children in the faith. This is no mean feat. David Voas's research indicates that religious parents only have a 1 in 2 chance of keeping their child in the faith. But Dawn's research is clearly indicating that this responsibility squarely rests with mothers, even at the expense of their own faith lives. So the examples of being shoehorned to the play corner of the church, or, you know, being pushed into engaging with a Sunday school session rather than adult worship, for example. And it doesn't really surprise me greatly in a climate where half of the churches don't have any children in them at all, and increasingly the children themselves opt out of religion. It's mothers who are held responsible and accountable. And this is supported by my own research, which Dawn kindly referenced there, on clergy mothers. If we think about the role of a priest on a Sunday, she has to be up front, leading the service. So it's often very difficult if your partner is not a churchgoer, or indeed if you're a single parent, to have your children with you in the church space. And basically, some of my clergy mothers struggled to include their children in their faith life. But what was interesting was that their motherhood was held to account by parishioners who questioned why their children weren't in church. Meanwhile, in Pauline's paper, we see the self-sacrificial nature of Rosie's motherhood. Pauline's assertion that Rosie knows that total devotion is expected of mothers is telling here. The tedium, the boredom, the relentless monotony that comes to a crisis point when TT refuses to take the bottled milk. And this is obviously demonstrated through the situation of Rosie in this prison-like flat, highlight the darker sides of motherhood away from the glossy magazine representations. And there's also a class dimension here, I think, as well, and I'd like to know a little bit more about Dawn's sample. We have Rosie's story, which could be considered to be constituting working class life, but whether it's Rosie or Rosie's life or the respondents of Dawn, there is a really strong urge not to ignore the child, as Louise, one of Dawn's participants, puts it. And Rosie generates the wrath of the reader in letting her child suffer when the child is ignored. And there's a later episode in the book where this is intensified when Titi's older and is poisoned by some fruit, and Rosie just takes a completely passive role in that. But Bev Skeggs' work on working class women asserts it is working class women themselves who are held to account over their motherhood more so than middle class mothers. So although middle class mothers may feel the constraints and costs of the endless ballet and piano practice or whatever, it is working class mothers who generate the most negative perceptions over how they mother. There's also a question that is raised in both papers about reconciling motherhood with self. Dawn was mentioning one of my respondents there, a priest who asserted that one of the most important things that had happened to her in recent years was becoming a mother. But what Dawn is also doing there is charting how this can be challenged at every turn. So the example of Kay, this potential of being swamped by the motherhood identity. Such strong articulations may go in some way in explaining why voluntary non-motherhood is perceived in such negative terms. Motherhood is seen to be at the centre of a woman's existence, so voluntarily choosing to displace this is a powerful decision, and it's not culturally supported, whether that be in religious context or beyond the religious framework. Meanwhile, Pauline discusses the trajectory from finding out about one's pregnancy and reconciling oneself to that news, and she mentions that the Virgin Mary would have experienced this, as does every pregnant woman. Pauline discusses this in terms of shock to acceptance. Indeed, women's acceptance of all of this is crucial to the cultural institution of motherhood. And we need to reflect on what would happen if more women did complain or question the sacrificial nature of motherhood. And this also raises a question for me about what broader impact Rosie Carpe's story offers. Is it simply interpreted in terms of bad motherhood from a young woman who is perceived as not knowing any better, or does it act as a radical challenge to the very institutionalised nature of motherhood? We also need to unpick what part religion is playing and how this interweaves with secular discourses. What difference does the religious context make? Is it a case that the expectations are simply heightened? Dawn describes Christianity as pro-natalist, and in Pauline's discussion of the Virgin Mary, it's easy to see why. An interesting discussion emerges about what part the Virgin plays. And of course, we must recognise that the Virgin herself is relevant to some Christian traditions much more so than others. But nonetheless, the Virgin has undoubtedly shaped what motherhood means for Christian women. And despite belonging to a Protestant tradition, a fair few of my Anglican clergy mothers referenced the Virgin when they talked about motherhood. So we can perhaps assess that the Virgin is making a conflicting and contradictory contribution to all of this. And I'd just like to quote Fauna here. Although Christianity did not on its own invent the motherhood myth, the Church has been highly efficient at marketing the maternal ideal. Mary is held up to Catholic women everywhere as an inspirational figure. Baby Jesus is never painted with his head thrown back and bawling. His mother never looks testy or tired. No one has ever painted Mary going about the mundane tasks of motherhood, and we've nicely had the collection of postcards that's just been distributed. Meanwhile, Nicholas Lee, in The Book of Mary, captures some of the complexities of Mary, notably the role that she plays in the sacred Eucharistic act, through giving Christ her body and blood. Now, for 2,000 years, the Church appropriated this role for men alone, but Slee reinserts Mary into this story as the original priest. This can have powerful reverberations as we consider what is sacred, what is profane, and challenging whether women's historical exclusion from the sacred is justified. But questions are still raised in these reinterpretations of Mary about whether the non-mother can ever be included in sacred terms, or if sacred is too problematic, we can talk in terms of value, which is that references back to Skeggs' work as well on working class women, or whether she is forever excluded. And this brings into focus an ultimate dilemma reinforced not only by religion but secular society too. With little tolerance for either the non-mother or the so-called bad mother, cultural imperatives demand much of mothers to be good. Instead, the non-mothers and Rosie Carpes of this world are held up as everything women should not be. And this is the distinction that keeps idealised motherhood on its pedestal.
I have a copy of that.